Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I understand that we are in competition with the sun at the moment, and normally it would be difficult to outshine the sun, but hopefully we can accomplish that while it's blacked out over the next hour. My name's Ian Ralby, and it's my absolute pleasure to be able to moderate this afternoon's panel on IUU fishing. Now, if we were to have this event 10 years ago, there's almost no chance that a subject on IUU fishing would have been included in even the thinking about the event, much less its execution. And so it is a bit of a sign of the times that we are sitting here to talk about this subject today. I am reminded of an experience I had about 12 years ago when I was at the Royal United Services Institute in London, and the then Chief of Naval Staff of Ghana, Admiral Kwarshi, had been invited to come and speak about the emerging threat of piracy in the region. And he got up and said, "Look, I'm really glad you are all interested in piracy, but I find it interesting that this is the first time I've ever been invited to come and speak to you. In fact, I'm not sure when the last time anyone from Ghana was invited to come and speak to you. And if you were really interested in the maritime security picture in our region, you would be less interested in the dozens of people that are perhaps involved in piracy, and much more interested in the thousands of people worth tens of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, that are being plundered from our waters in the form of IUU fishing." And it was a sobering moment. It was true. He was talking about the fact that there was an ongoing problem that was just not being attended to by anyone almost at all. And so it was a sad reality that those who knew the maritime spaces of different parts of the world the best were those that would do it harm and that would plunder its resources. And so over the last decade and a half, we've seen a gradual increase in the visibility of IUU fishing as a phenomenon worthy of attention across a lot of different sectors. And I've had the pleasure of working over my career in about 95 different countries. And I would say in about 90 of those, it turns out that IUU fishing is primarily the top function of both the Navy and the Coast Guard, as well as the top concern for any of the political actors interested in the maritime domain. And yet, we still tend to over-prioritize other issues with fewer people involved and fewer overall threats to the life on land, whereas we don't tend to find IUU fishing sufficiently interesting, sexy, or dynamic to give it the attention that it likely deserves. So today, we will change that. And I think it's important to note that no matter what your interest is, there is something for you in this subject. If your interest is in sustainability and the environment, this is very much a sustainability and environmental issue. If your interest is in food and food security, this is very much a food and food security issue, especially when you consider that 20% of global dietary protein intake comes from fish, and in some countries, that amount is as high as 90%. If your interest is in the economy, this is an enormous economic activity, employing hundreds of millions of people around the world and accounting for hundreds of billions of dollars worth of economic activity each year. If your interest is in criminality around labor, this is very much a human trafficking, migrant smuggling, and human slavery issue. If your interest is in financial flows and the illicit financial flows that fund all sorts of nefarious activity, this is a fantastic opportunity to look at the issue as a forum for money laundering and other financial crimes. If your interest is in terrorism, this is one of the areas where terrorists have found so little attention that it provides them the opportunity to not only finance their activities, but build the sustainability, logistics chains, and intelligence networks needed to be able to perpetrate all sorts of attacks. And if your interest is in the most nefarious state actors that would threaten the US national security interests, this is a topic for you as well, both in terms of how states are manipulating the maritime space and how they are pursuing both territorial control and platforms for greater intelligence capabilities to try to outstrip us. So I want to just mention that this is not a uniform subject. Not only does it have all these different areas of interest inherent in it, we have a lot of different issues that are encapsulated in the term IUU fishing. Illegal fishing is fundamentally about fishing that has violated the law, like it sounds. But the U and the U tend to be overlooked altogether. Unreported fishing is when fishing is done perhaps in a legal fashion, but then it is not reported, meaning that no tax is paid, no catch is accounted for, and no ability to monitor the sustainability of the seas is afforded. Unregulated, though, is where it happens in a vacuum, where there is a lack of regulation and oversight and governance, and thus an inability to actually control the activity that's occurring. And that could be out in the exclusive economic zone or even in the nearshore areas where species like sea cucumbers or rare turtles are perhaps unaccounted for by cookie-cutter regulations that were copied and pasted from somebody else's waters and somebody else's maritime environment. And so those three different phenomena that are actually addressed by three different actors: illegal fishing by law enforcement, unreported by maritime administrations, and unregulated by legal, legislative, and regulatory bodies, are all grouped together in this catch-all term of IUU fishing. But we also have a lot of different issues that tend to be labeled as IUU fishing that have no fishing involved at all, or that are definitely not just IUU fishing. One of those is fisheries crime. It's the use of the fishing sector for illicit activities like drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking. There are no fish involved in those activities, and yet fishing vessels, the people who are responsible for our fishing, are involved in those criminal activities. And so we tend to blur those together. At the same time, we have to look at state-protected illicit fishing, where governments are using their diplomatic, their physical activity, their ability to fund development projects and other corrupt practices to protect their own fleets in engaging in illegal activities in other people's waters. So they are allowing their own state apparatus to protect the plundering of someone else's resources. We also have hybrid aggression, an increasingly hot topic, where the use of what look like fishing vessels for other purposes are becoming a challenge for many, and particularly in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea, where we see the People's Armed Force Maritime Militia being involved in different activities. And we have to ask the question, what are they? Are they fishing vessels? Are they commercial vessels? Are they sovereign vessels? Can you board them? Can you arrest them? What can you do? And unfortunately, very few want to be the test case to find out. And finally, strategic presence. We often fail to look at how fishing fleets are used by nefarious actors for other benefits. I've talked about terrorism, I've talked about some of the criminality, but states are using their fishing fleets in order to gain intelligence, but they're also using them in order to have strategic presence to potentially lay claim to all kinds of territorial grounds. And if you need evidence of that, China has, in 2010, articulated a strategy that says, and I quote, "Occupying brings about rights and interests." So if we think they are just fishing, we aren't listening to what they are saying or watching what they are doing. So this brings us to a question: what can and what should the United States do about this ever-growing issue that has taken us by storm in terms of different areas of concern? And so that's what we are here to discuss today. Over the last several months, Airbus has generously funded the Center for Maritime Strategy to be able to hold a series of seminars on this topic, and we've had the chance to speak with a lot of different interlocutors who come at this from these different areas and vantage points. And we've begun to assemble different ideas for how the US could better tackle this, not just by one agency or another, but as a whole-of-government approach to combating IUU fishing at home and abroad, given all its various areas of concern. So today we have a perfect panel to discuss this, and so it's my delight to introduce Rear Admiral Joanne Burdian, who's the Assistant Commandant of the US Coast Guard for Response, Rear Admiral Jack Vogt, who is a former Coast Guard officer. He was in the same position at one point as Admiral Burdian, but he was also commander of Coast Guard District 13 and is now in the private sector. We have Ms. Kim Murphy, who is a senior director for intelligence programs at Airbus, and obviously somebody we have to thank for having sponsored this whole series. And finally, my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy, Admiral Jamie Fogo, with whom I've had the chance to work on this issue for quite a few years in Africa and beyond. So I will sit down, join them, and let each of them first introduce themselves from the vantage point of IUU fishing, and then carry on into a discussion, and then we'll open up to questions in just a little bit. So Admiral Burdian.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jo Burdian. I'm Assistant Commandant for Response Policy, and I think the thing I've learned about counter-IUU fishing most recently is don't speak immediately after Dr. Ralby. Gosh, what an amazing and comprehensive explanation of why we're here today and what challenges all of us together. Where I live in the world of counter-IUU fishing is, one, I oversee the Organic Coast Guard program, that oversees those operations, that provides policy and strategy to support our operators in the field. And that's both our domestic fisheries and our counter-IUUF work. But also, I'm the proud co-chair of the Maritime Safe Interagency Work Group, which was created by the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act and challenged 21 agencies, all of whom have some authority and jurisdiction to counter IUU fishing, to work together to figure out how we integrate our US government approach, how we establish priorities and then execute those. We, in 2022, finally published a strategic plan that identified 5 priority flag states or administrations. So the administration is Taiwan. Our priority flag states are Vietnam, Senegal, Ecuador, and Panama. And so from there, figuring out how we really work together alongside allies and partners, those priority flag states in priority regions, and alongside non-governmental partners, public and private, nonprofit, and industry, to really get after this challenge. As you said so eloquently, I think no one is able to recuse themselves from the challenge of IUU fishing. We talked about 20% of the world's population relying on the sea for their source of protein, and the basic reality that about 90% of fish stocks are overfished or at risk of being overfished. So whether you're in the Gulf of Guinea, the Gulf of Alaska, or Papua New Guinea, we are all of us of the sea and aligned with our need to respond to this particular challenge.
Thank you very much. And I think we'd love to hear more in a bit about the interagency working group, because I think that is a really important piece of how to move forward so that it isn't just one agency, one service that is taking the lead on this or taking the exclusive responsibility on this. So Admiral Vogt, if you could talk a little bit about the experiences going from Coast Guard to industry and how you've seen the issue from those two different sides.
Well, thanks, Ian. Appreciate the kind introduction, and certainly would be remiss if we didn't thank the Center for Maritime Strategy and certainly Airbus for hosting this, and just appreciate the opportunity. I think great introduction, but I'll add probably my closest interaction with this IUU problem was flying the EEZ and finding foreign flag vessels in our EEZ. At the time it was shark finning, conducting this illicit activity and getting a symbol of international love from the crew. I won't give it to all of you, but that's hands-on, seeing how they felt about us interdicting them, conducting this illicit activity. But what is the for-profit or nonprofit sector doing, NGO actors? Airbus, in sponsoring this series of workshops. Airbus certainly provides capability for the United States, but as well as allies and partners around the globe to address this issue, but also creating awareness and sharing information on the problem, and as Dr. Ralby so eloquently explained, how IUUF connects to a host of illicit activity and transnational crime around the world. So these type of workshops and information sharing is another area that's key, and technology is where the non-government sector is really providing a leg up on this problem. Just in the last 10 years, satellite technology combined with AI, we're now taking the EO, the VIIRS, nighttime electrical, optical, synthetic aperture radar, IR, all of that technology being fed into AI systems that are doing data distribution, advanced computing, to allow us to be predictive on where the fish are, and thus knowing where the fisheries are going to be, and primarily looking after those dark fleets, the distant water fleet that are not transmitting. That will help us optimize where we send our precious resources. We'll hear a lot about that today, that we don't have enough assets on the surface to interdict these vessels and conduct law enforcement operations. And then the last thing I'll mention, another area, working with a group now, the Hawaii Longline Association. This problem is affecting the United States fleets. This isn't just a foreign or international problem. In Hawaii, the 150 vessels that make up the Longline fleet provide about 50% of all the swordfish landings in the US and 60 to 95% of all tuna landings in the US, depending on the species. They're the #1 food provider for the state of Hawaii and along the West Coast to some extent for seafood. That fleet regularly faces aggressive actions in international waters and certainly observe foreign flag vessels creeping into the EEZ, depending on how the tuna and the swordfish are moving, and taking our precious resources, again, conducting that illicit activity. The Hawaii Longline Group, to combat this, we're working right now on an MOU with our Coast Guard Command in Hawaii to set up pierside safety boardings, to set up familiarization, vessel familiarization for the Coast Guard inspectors. But probably most important is an information sharing regimen where that Hawaii Longline fleet is going to be providing the Coast Guard information on illicit activity observed in our EEZ and international waters so that Coast Guard enforcement authorities can respond. So a few ways where the private sector is helping out.
Thank you, sir. And I think one of the points you made there is really interesting, the notion of following the fish. We often tend to target our technology towards the action of vessels and the human beings on them. But actually following the fish can very quickly help separate those who are fishing from those who are not,
right,
based on whether there's actually fish there. Kim, if you can tell us a little bit more about that technology piece and how Airbus, which is not normally a name that you'd expect to hear in an IUU fishing context, is contributing to this effort.
Thank you. I was a former naval officer and then a consultant for Coast Guard intelligence. And so in those roles as an intelligence professional, I was always looking for dark targets. So that is something that when I came to Airbus US, I found capabilities to identify dark targets. And those are usually doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, illegal fishing, unregulated fishing being one of the things that that they would be doing. So we have SAR technology with AI-based algorithms that detect in open ocean vessels. Once you detect that vessel, we can tip and cue our electro-optical satellites and take pictures of those vessels at a resolution where you can actually identify the vessel. So instead of, that's a vessel, we think it's a fishing vessel, you can say that is the blah, 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 with the name of the vessel, and have some information that would enable you to take legal action or diplomatic action to interdict these, illegal entities, foreign entities that are, robbing the seas of, the sustainable ecosystem. So those capabilities, plus now with all of the unclassified capabilities that are available, we can share information with our partners across the US and the non-governmental agencies, plus our partners in the Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, all sorts of partner nations who are in this fight as well as we are, to RF intercepts. We can hull tech a vessel based on their navigation radar or their communications capability. So dark targets are able to be found today. And that's the big difference that we see these days as opposed to 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that capability can be brought to the table by industry, Airbus US, and our partners, our colleagues across the industry. Everybody is working on this problem. And if we can all support this objective, then we can make inroads against the illegal activity. So when we worked with Admiral Fogo at the Center for Maritime Strategy, and we were working on how do we bring something to light, this was the topic that we selected. And I'm very happy to say that we've made some good progress on figuring out what to do to attack this problem.
Well, and I'm delighted to hear that, and I'm very honored to have had hopefully a useful role in that. And I think one of the shocks has been just how quickly the technology has advanced over the last 10 years. And I do want to point out, for anyone that is not familiar with the term SAR, it isn't search and rescue, it is synthetic aperture radar. That is my favorite reason for spelling out acronyms when talking about this subject, but I think that synthetic aperture radar combined with electrical optical imagery has gotten us closer to what a lot of people used to sort of dream of having CCTV on the water, and actually being able to light up a otherwise invisible, untrackable vessel is really an incredible capability that we now have in a commercial context as well as in a government context. So I think it's really come a long way. So Admiral Fogo, I've enjoyed working with you on this topic for about a decade now, and I'm looking to hear your thoughts as a Navy officer, how you came to be so engaged with IUU fishing.
Well, thanks, Dr. Ralby. Ian and I are great friends, and we go back over a decade. He is probably the most effective weapon system that the Naval War College has, because when you dispatch him to places like the Gulf of Guinea or North Africa or throughout Europe, his level of knowledge, understanding, his ability to relate to people is just unmatched. And same with everybody else here on the stage. I mean, first of all, kudos to Airbus for doing this. You know, our national president, he wouldn't mind me saying this, Townie Townsend, who's wandering around, flies an Airbus. He's a long-haul pilot that goes to South Africa. I think he was the first guy to land the Airbus 380 in Johannesburg. It's kind of short on the airstrip there. He also goes to Korea. And he came to me after he saw one of these seminars, and he goes, hey, why is the Center for Maritime Strategy doing IUUF? And do we have a sponsor? I go, yeah, actually, the airplane you fly, Airbus is sponsoring. He goes, really? And I go, Townie, you have no idea how difficult this problem is and how important it is. And Airbus listens to people like Larry Fink of BlackRock, you know, who sends out his annual letter on EGS. This is really important. You know, Airbus has inroads all over the world, Malaysia, Indonesia, Africa, you know, all over. They're flying their airplanes all over. And those client nations have a problem. And it's protein being taken out of their mouths and out of the mouths of their children. So this is a very noble effort, and I commend you, both Kim and Admiral Vogt. And for Admiral Burdian, it's just been a real pleasure. She helped us kick off the first one. And I don't know, I think it's official because she told me, but there's the best command in the Coast Guard, next to being the Commandant, I think, is to be the commander of Joint Interagency Task Force South in the Southcom AOR in Key West. I've been down there many times. I did a counter-drug operation for a whole deployment on my submarine, and you're the next commander. So let's give her a round of applause, please. Congratulations, Joanne. So well deserved. So back to the question, how did I get here? You know, I'm a kid that grew up in Northern Ontario. I was born a Canadian. My dad was an attaché, so I became an American. I went to the Naval Academy, interviewed with Rick over, and he took me for some reason. My life and my career in 40 years is categorized as 3 12s plus 4. 12 years underwater on submarines, 12 years in the Pentagon. That was worse than being underwater in a submarine, by the way. And then 12 years overseas, and I had the pleasure of commanding the USS Oklahoma City, where I swam with the fishes, so there was my first connection, and then commanded 8 more times, many in dual-hatted commands, and many under the title of NAVAF, Naval Forces Africa. I first met the commander of AFRICOM, General Kip Ward. He had been down in the Balkans, in Kosovo, and in Sarajevo when I was a captain on the Joint Staff. Great guy. And when he took over AFRICOM, he came to the Pentagon. And this is important regarding IUUF. He said, all right, you guys, the first thing I did wrong was to go all around the continent and brief prime ministers and defense ministers on what I was doing as the new combatant commander of AFRICOM. My first slide said, this is my AOR. And it had a picture, a map of the continent of Africa, chart, water all around it. And the Africans looked at him and they said, General, what's an AOR? He goes, my area of responsibility. And they go, whose responsibility, General? Yours or ours? We live here, you don't. Lesson number 1. And then he told me, and I was a young officer at the time when I went to this brief in 2008, he said, remember, it's African solutions to African problems. So if you ever get over there, Fogo, do not impose upon our African hosts. They have to figure it out on their own. We can't do it for them, but we can help them. And so that's kind of how I got into this. As I rolled into the different jobs in Europe and Africa as a one-star, the first thing we did was say, well, what do they need to enforce, to do law enforcement and security in their waters? And at the time, there was a very popular phrase in the Gulf of Guinea where a lot of this illicit trafficking and illegal fishing takes place. It was called sea blindness. And when I first met Ian, we were combating sea blindness. What did they know? What could they do? Did they even know how to run a boat? Then we bought them some boats, Defender boats, like a 25-foot thing with a couple of outboard motors, really fun to drive. And we tried to get them to go out to sea and enforce, security in their own territorial waters. But as Mark Ferguson and Michelle Howard and Harry Harris told me, don't go too far, don't overdo it. Don't think that they're going to be able to go out to 12 miles and then out to an economic zone of 250 miles, small steps. So we started at 0 to 3 miles. That required creating an exercise program. So we had the Express series of exercises. East Coast of Africa, Cutlass Express. North Coast of Africa, Phoenix Express. West Coast of Africa, one that Ian participated in many times, Obangami Express. And they were great. Everybody showed up. They wanted to be with the Americans and they wanted to do this. But boy, it was a struggle. And it was frustrating because they just didn't know what to do. And so we persisted on the training. We persisted in visiting and talking to them, and we kept to our guns on, these are African solutions to African problems. We can't do it for you. You got to do it yourself. And we started to notice a difference when the Africans got together and created the Yaoundé Code of Conduct along the coastlines of the Gulf of Guinea, where regions were divided by territorial lines carried out to sea, but then there were ways to collaborate and cooperate. And they did so in 2016. Maybe we can talk about the Motor Vessel Maximus case a little bit later on. And it's important because even though they're taking down pirates or illegal traffickers in narcotics, weapons, or human trafficking, that applies to the IUUF problem. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service helped develop a search and seizure guide because even in Africa, in some places that you might consider the third world, there is still a law and order and justice system. And if you don't do the search and the labeling of evidence and take all the photographs carefully, then the case will be dismissed and that individual will be back on the boat the next day. So it's important to be able to train law enforcement and go deep inland to get the court system and the judges on board. When they had problems with their ships, we did deployments in our high-speed vessels, the expeditionary patrol frigates, we call them. We sent the Spearhead down there. And I told my African friends, we will sail on your ships, we will train you on your ships alongside you, and we will repair your ships. And the only ship that I ask in return is your friendship. Because one thing Admiral Mullen and the Joint Staff taught me when I worked for him was, you can't surge trust. You have to build it over time. And slowly but surely, it started to take fold. And the Africans started to solve their own problems. And I think by the time I left in 2019, I wrote a series of articles and I went and looked them up in Defense One. I called it My African Trilogy. And surprised how much I had forgotten about it. It really went from sea blindness to kind of like night and day. The light bulb went on and they started to take care of their own business. And so that's kind of how I got involved in this thing as a naval officer and submariner. And I'm proud to tell you that at the end of the day, I think we made a difference. But I saw my friend, Ambassador George Ward, who was a 3-time ambassador in Africa last week. Ian knows him. Now, George is retired now, he's in his 70s, but he's still out there punching above his weight class. He did a piece for War on the Rocks called The Eagle and the Dragon in Africa, comparing data on Chinese and American influence. And as much as we did down there in that 10-year period, we're holding our own with the Chinese. And the Chinese are part of the problem. The Shaoxin 26, 27, and 28, 3 fishing boats, were arrested multiple times on my watch when I was commander of Naval Forces Africa. They'd go into port, they'd pay the fine, and they'd be right back out to sea again. So if we don't do more and we don't stay involved both on the ground and on the water on the African continent, this is going to come back to haunt us, and the Chinese are going to beat us down there. So this is a very important concept, I think, to keep in mind when we talk about why IUUF is so important. Back to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I think that story of the vessels being arrested over and over again comes up all over the world. And often, I will confess at the moment that I am a lawyer by background, but often there's a problem with the law, that the law is not fit for purpose. It isn't directed towards actually deterring the conduct that it's supposed to. And so I've actually heard fishing operators describe exactly that phenomenon as local tax. So being arrested and paying a fine is just local tax, because the value of their operation is so much higher than what any of the penalties are in place. And I often had to explain that if you catch illegally a ton of tuna off the coast of the United States, and the penalty is several $1 million, and if you catch the exact same ton of the exact same tuna having swum across the Atlantic, and the penalty is $20,000 or $2,000, where do you think all the criminals are going to go to commit their illegal activity? It's just a low cost of doing business in a risk-reward calculus for any kind of criminal actor. So I think I want to ask the whole panel this question about patch protection, because we have talked about it from a technology standpoint, a government standpoint, a Navy standpoint, a Coast Guard standpoint. I'm curious what you think about how, given the different types of interest anybody has, how likely it is that people are going to be more and more willing to work with others to combat this holistically. Because I've seen firsthand issues of literally the international organizations responsible for this problem unwilling to cooperate with others. Concrete example. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN is working on a global vessel record to try to identify every single fishing vessel around the world of all sizes. And so that there be one comprehensive list of all the fishing vessels. When asked if they'd be willing to use that for also sharing with law enforcement agencies who are interested in drugs or interested in human trafficking or interested in weapons trafficking, they said no. This is a sustainability issue. And so even though that same record would be incredibly helpful for the DEA, for example, who arrest a fishing vessel on Monday with one set of drugs and one set of crew, and arrest the same fishing vessel on Friday with a different set of drugs and different set of crew, to be able to say, hey, we keep arresting this same vessel, let's pierce the corporate veil, let's find who the beneficial owner is, and let's go after them. The sustainability focus was preventing that law enforcement effort from happening. So how much are you seeing, ma'am, patch protection in the interagency working group of the US?
You know, Ian, at the beginning of your discussion, you talked about the nuance of how 10 years ago we wouldn't be here at Sea or Space talking about a topic like counter-IUU fishing. And so I think what that says to me is that change takes time. It also takes timing. And so while perhaps today the FAO is unwilling to share that, if we do our job as an interagency, as a US government, to really articulate the intersection of criminality and focus on counter-IUU fishing, not just as counter-IUU fishing, right? Like many of the organizations that support this, right, non-state actors are criminality agnostic, right? Like they're in it to win it, to make money. So, and going back to the previous discussion of the ability to enforce, I sit here as a Coast Guardsman understanding full well we are not going to monitor, control, or surveil our way into more sustainable fishing practices or responsible labor practices. That there is infrastructure that has to be built with our partners around the globe. And that really is the value of the interagency work group, that we have every agency in the United States government with some ability to lift capability, capacity, to provide a more rigid framework to support our partners is involved. We're organized regionally because, let's face it, I talked about the Gulf of Guinea, the Gulf of Alaska, and Papua New Guinea. The challenges, opportunities, and risks are different in all of those regions. And so we have organized ourselves to be cognizant of those and to deliver service based on the needs of the region. I did also want to acknowledge, like, Jack Vogt had my job. and Scott Clendenin, who's also here, had my job. So you have like 75% of the last 4 CG5Rs. But I offer that this at least, again, this is going to take time to move the United States government and to move the global community of interest into a place that reflects where we need to go. Admiral Fogo talked about the creation of Obengami Express. I'm proud to say that we'll be providing law enforcement detachments in support of Obengami Express. We've got 19 bilateral agreements around the world that support shipwrights for the purpose of counter IUUF. And we're hopeful to provide observers on board our Brazilian partners on one of their vessels for that same purpose. We are innovating constantly from an MCS perspective, monitoring, control, and surveillance. But again, we acknowledge that trade, treasury, labor, customs and border protection, all of us have a part to play together to just create a global market that's inhospitable to fish that's caught using harmful labor practices or not sustainably. And we really just need to lift the capability of our partners.
Well, I think it's interesting you mentioned Treasury. It's only been, I think, 2 years, since December 9th of 2 years ago, that OFAC, our Office of Foreign Asset Controls, first sanctioned a fishing entity. And that was a novel development.
Yes.
Do you want to speak to that at all?
No, I do. And I will say we're trying to replicate that capability inside of the interagency work group, because understanding beneficial ownership is really important. Certainly labor had an interest in understanding that there were harmful labor practices being used. There were, the irregularities, the illegality of the fishing itself, but being able to trace the beneficial ownership ultimately resulted in the delisting of 2 companies from NASDAQ, which when you talk about penalty, that kind of direct financial impact is very, very important.
That hurts.
Yes.
And I think the whole world has gotten a flavor for how difficult identifying beneficial owners of vessels are with both the Houthi attacks and even some of the individual vessels that have run into trouble, like the Dali in my hometown of Baltimore. And everybody's kind of going, wait, it's flagged in one country. The registered owner is one person. There's a beneficial owner, but then there's another beneficial owner. Then there's a financier. There are like 20 different nationalities and entities involved in the ownership structure of a single commercial vessel. And in the fishing space, it is sometimes even more convoluted, with dozens of shell companies involved in the ownership. And so I think getting to that beneficial ownership is going to be critically important. And that's where actually private sector has a huge role to help play as well. So Admiral Vogt, you talked a little bit about NGOs and non-state entities that can play a role. We've seen a really interesting surge in particularly nonprofit actors getting involved in the IUU fishing space. And they've kind of come in on a couple different levels. We've heard about the technology, so entities like Global Fishing Watch, Strigmat Tracking, others that provide philanthropically free maritime domain awareness platforms focused on IUU fishing. We've also heard about Sea Shepherd, which provide an operational, almost taxi service for fisheries protection officers who don't have a Navy or don't have enough of a Navy to rely on to get out to sea. We've seen others providing analytical tools, all kinds of different support. Is there a danger of sort of losing this from the government control standpoint into the private sector? And how do we make sure that we are balancing that? Because I think that's always a concern, particularly from your background in the Coast Guard, of making sure that it is a law enforcement agency that is tasked with law enforcement and that isn't vested in some NGO that's funded by a billionaire.
I think that a great analogy is the space program and where we are in that realm from the standpoint of what technologies, what capabilities, and we've seen that in this fight over the last 10 years, where we are with satellite technology and AI, advanced computing, and what we can do now. We know where the fish are, we know where the dark fleet is. In that context, and Joanne touched on it, if we can disincentivize the financial ability, and I think that's where the for-profit and nonprofit sector plays a huge role in denying the ability of these companies to come in and make money, and then in partnership with the governments, port state control measures where we deny port entry, and then Joanne mentioned shipwriter programs. I think collaboration between government and non-government organizations, just like we've seen in the space sector, can not only advance technology, but also help create greater awareness, which will help us advance the legal side of this entire issue.
I think that's a fantastic point. And Kim, on the point of technology, and particularly on the intel side of it, often the countries that have the most maritime territory often have very little land, interestingly enough. And I spent a lot of time in the Pacific where the expanse of the ocean that these states have to control with a population of 18,000 or even 1,800 is just immense. So how can the technology be integrated in such a way as to really empower the actors more effectively? I mean, I think there always has to be that human interface. But how does Airbus take what it's able to do on a global scale and help a microstate be able to secure and govern its fisheries?
So in the realm of geospatial intelligence, for example, it used to be that if you got one picture, one image, from space, it was awesome. But these days, you get so many that you can't even look at them all. So the capability to go through that in an automated fashion with analytics, excuse me, and AI-based algorithms has become just commonplace. So giving a microstate the results of all of the input, you don't want to feed them all of the sensor data. You don't want to feed them the AIS logs. You don't want to feed them the images themselves or even the locations of all the vessels. You want to give them that information in a consumable way so that they can actually action the things that they have the resources to action and prioritize their resources against those things that make the most sense from their perspective.
I think
yeah, go ahead, please.
I think it's just wonderful to be here alongside all of you. Within the interagency work group, we've set up a domain awareness and intelligence and information sharing work group, acknowledging exactly what you just described, and we've welcomed non-governmental partners into all of our regional sub-working groups. Because I think you're absolutely right. What we need to do is help our partners really understand the patterns of life that are occurring in their water so they can apply their limited resources in a way that makes sense, and also ask for help from us, from their partners, in a way that also makes sense.
I think that there's one other thing that that we've kind of recognized as you were starting, the session. You talked about all of the ways that IUUF is applicable to different sectors of people's, what they're interested in. But I doubt that there's many people that can tell you what the two U's stand for.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So we are describing something called IUUF that people don't understand, right? And it's a complicated problem even if you do understand it. And we are maybe having some trouble getting traction with the larger part of, the world, because we talk about it in terms that don't resonate with them.
Yeah.
And so part of our problem is that we have to speak, as you were speaking, in AFRICOM, to the Africans in their own language, with their own perspective. We have to speak to the people who are impacted with IUUF in a way that makes sense to them, so that we can take our new laws or our new joint capabilities and bring them to bear.
Well, I think this is such an important point, because it isn't just a fishing-related problem. It isn't an Africa-related problem or a Pacific Islands problem or any part of the world problem. It's a global issue that we're all living on land and so terrestrially focused by nature. And so we often forget or don't understand the nexus between what is happening at sea and our life on land. And we see this over and over again. I mean, how many days before people forget about what just happened in Baltimore, or what happened in the Suez in March 2021, or any of these incidents that suddenly bring to consciousness everybody's reliance on maritime supply chains, on maritime activity, on fishing, and yet then we kind of forget about it and go back to it. And so we do need that consistent particularly for the political classes who are tempted to focus on land, particularly in a democracy, because no voters live on the water. How do you get people motivated and having the political will to do something about it? And to the point of audience, sir, I want to ask you, you talked about your 12 years in submarines, and I'm sure at some point you got to the point of saying, I am commanding a lethal force under the water, and this is a fantastic accomplishment. If you were then told, well, that's great, but now your biggest threat is a couple fishing vessels on the surface, how would you have responded to that? Because I find it really difficult sometimes to convey to a carrier strike group commander that after decades of work to become at the top of the food chain when it comes to lethality, that the biggest force that they're fighting is a bunch of fishing boats. And that isn't a message that is all that palpable or something that you want to hear. So how do we communicate a Navy role? How do we define a Navy role? And how do we make it not so intolerable?
Yeah, so that was a great question. I got a great story about Jayat of South. I'll tell you in a second. But I want to just take one step back to what Kim said about talking to, whoever it is, whoever the host nation is, whoever the group of nations are that you're dealing with. And in this case, in Gulf of Guinea, the Africans. So the Ghanaian Navy, and Ian knows every one of the CNOs and CHODs back to the gentleman you talked about earlier, and Seth Amawano, who is just CHOD and CNO, was one of my friends. They were the ones that brought the Haishan 26, 27, 28 in several times. And I said to them, where is this ship? I was down there. They will take you to the pier. So I look at it. I wouldn't have wanted to have gone to sea in this vessel. It was a wooden kind of scowish looking thing. It wasn't very big. And then as the dumb American, I asked the question, well, if they're illegally fishing, they don't have licenses, they had crew members on board they were mistreating, and they hadn't gone through proper hiring practices. They were fishing in places they shouldn't, like spawning areas. They were taking a catch that was smaller than it should have been, using the wrong rig, purse seine, and all that. They nail them for all these things. But what do they do with the fish? I mean, the fish are going to spoil the look of that ship. You couldn't just fill up the hold with ice and go back to China. So what do they do with the fish? Is there a mothership out there someplace? And the Ghanaians looked at me and they go, they take them to the cannery in town. And I go, you're canning the fish for them? They go, no, they have Chinese canneries here. I was like, why'd you do that? Well, it was just, they needed money. And so, you could be your own worst enemy. So it was interesting to open up that aperture and understand what you're dealing with down in a place like Ghana or any other country. And then on the issue of a submarine going after fishermen, I actually wouldn't have a problem with that because my first deployment in command of Oklahoma City was at Jayat South, and we were going after go-fast cigarette boats that were coming out of Colombia carrying drugs to America. And a submarine is a perfect platform to do this. Very expensive one, $3 billion platform, but you hear them a long ways away and you can track them real fast because we're like a shark underwater, apex predator, we go fast. And then we can come up and send a message and the surface ship can intercept them. So it actually is a mission that can be done. It's a question of priorities. That gets back to, well, what are the priorities for the Navy? The Navy's got so many things they're doing out there. I'm absolutely amazed with everything the Coast Guard does with a reasonable sized or a moderate sized force. The Navy is looking at, the adversary in the Western Pacific, the Straits of Taiwan, South China Sea. But don't forget, as Stu Munch, my successor in Europe, will remind you that there's a hell of a lot going on over there and also in the Middle East. So can we move this up the set of priorities into something that we do on a day-to-day basis? It was very important to Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus to be a part of IUUF and to stem the tide of illegal trafficking. He spent a lot of time in the Gulf of Guinea, and when the Secretary of the Navy comes to your theater more than once during your command tour, like 3 or 4 times, you realize he really believes in this. He did a conference in Annapolis. It was very successful. He invited all the African partners, put his finger in my chest and told me what he wanted me to do. One of the things that he wanted me to do was to build a school in the Ashanti region of Ghana because the Ashanti king asked him to do that. And this gets back to you can't surge trust. You have to build it over time. And everybody complained about that. You know, it was no big deal. We sent the Seabees down there. They erected a wooden schoolhouse. It looked really nice when they painted it up, and the Ghanaians loved it. And then we were, you know, the first priority when it came to port visits and doing things and exercises. And so if Mavis was on board, you know, as we went through this cycle in the last administration of a revolving door of service secretaries, people kind of lost interest. But Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro, who will be here throughout the week, he's interested. Joanne told me she had a meeting with him last week. His big theme is maritime statecraft. This is all part of it. And an undercurrent of maritime statecraft for America is below threshold of war level of competition with our adversaries, wink, wink, nod, nod, China. And so, like Airbus, he realizes how important IUUF is. And it remains to be seen whether we will put ships on the problem. I relied on the Coast Guard to help me, and a different commandant at the time, Commandant Schultz, who gave me a fantastic cutter that was about, I don't know, 38 years old, the Thetis. And those guys came over and did magnificent things in the Gulf of Guinea, both for IUUF and illegal trafficking. Big success story. So we've got to continue to do this. Otherwise, per Ambassador George Ward's thesis, we're going to lose in the war of ideas.
Some grim words there. I want to, on that happy note, turn to the audience and see if there are any questions that you would like to direct to the panel. We started a few minutes late thanks to the eclipse, and we're not, fortunately, we're not forced out of this room right now. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to come to the microphone. I also want to open it up to the panel. Do any of you want to ask each other anything?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, I mean, we really have been on a journey of discovery and maturation in the interagency work group. We've restructured a couple of times over the last couple of years to just try and find the right way to approach this. How are we doing in terms of advertising to all of you that there's a forum to harness what you're bringing to the table and deliver to our partners around the world? I think not well.
I think there is opportunity to create more membership out of the
Right.
Private sector, whether that be for-profit or nonprofit.
Right. I think that sometimes there's a fear on the part of the government that industry partners are only there to sell you something. However, we are there to be partners. We are there to help solve a global problem because we are global citizens, and we do care beyond the selling you an airplane. So I would just suggest that there would be participation, even if there's not the what's in it for me, clearly stated on, the invitation. So, please feel free to leverage our either expertise or our capabilities or our insight or our questions. And, we're here to help.
Joanne, you said something earlier, I think that's really important in regard to that question, and that is, if you can somehow turn the consumer around on this, and so look at blood diamonds or sweatshops in the textile industry. Once they are outed by social media or by the press, and it's a credible story that you have, kids in there that are 8 years old working these things, or look at the distant water fishing fleet and how they impress labor on those ships. If you can prove that some entity, state or non-state actor, is taking protein out of the mouths of African children and really broadcast that out across a wide and far net, there might be some, social activity out there where people say, we're going to boycott, this particular company that, takes fish from these people, or we're going to boycott goods and services from this particular state actor, whoever that may be. And, people are funny. They're a lot different nowadays than when I grew up. Some folks will say, I don't care who gets the fish as long as I can get my can of tuna. But nowadays, people make choices. And that consumer choice is a extremely powerful thing. So I think that's where one area where we could really concentrate on and make a difference. And we haven't cracked that code yet.
Yes, sir. I think NOAA and CBP are working that particular, but you're right. We don't talk about it often, Ina.
Yeah.
Yeah, our strategic communications on this, both internally and externally, do bear some improvement.
Sir.
I think we have a question, so please.
Yes, sir. My name is Justin Davis. I'm head of strategy for a defense tech startup called Saronic. We're based in Austin, Texas, and we're building autonomous surface vessels for defense and security. And I'd like to piggyback on Ms. Murphy's comment about private sector partners interested in problem solving, not just here to sell you something. Absolutely recognize the gravity of this issue and want to say thanks to the panelists. It's been super informative. I think that, Admiral Fogo, to your point about using a $3 billion submarine to chase a drug runner, and then later intimating that it's a question of if certain assets might get applied to a certain problem set. I'd like to offer that there are tools and technology that are becoming available that might present opportunities to conduct those things at a price point that is sub $3 billion. At something that might be palatable not just for the U.S. Coast Guard, NOAA, law enforcement, but also for foreign partners that also can't afford a similar type of naval assets. And so as an example of the value proposition, I think distributed autonomous systems might be able to provide a persistence and reach that limited manned assets might be challenged with, and also might be able to get closer. So in terms of being able to either expose or identify folks that are doing these things and or contribute to sort of a basis of evidence for further prosecution, there are jobs there that I think the systems might be able to perform. My question is twofold. One, how else or in what roles might distributed autonomous systems be helpful in this space? And then two, where do we go? Who should we engage with to get involved? How can we help be involved in the problem solving? Thanks.
Good questions. Does anyone want to take that on?
I think that's a great point, right? So that's why last year at this very forum, the Secretary of the Navy exported Task Force 59 from the Arabian Gulf to the 4th Fleet AOR, where Joanne will go down and command Jayat South. And Jim Aiken, who was my Desron commander, is doing a great job of testing unmanned systems in the war on drugs, and there's no reason why we couldn't use these systems. And when I say test, we don't need to test this stuff. You guys got these capabilities. I've seen it. You know, a number of different companies who are here and represented down on the watch floor downstairs have got real capability that works. Let's get it out there, just like they did in 5th Fleet, and let's use it. So where does it come into play here? I think clearly in law enforcement for IUUF, you almost have to get the evidence with human beings on board the illegal ships, right? So a drone is not going to do that for you, but a drone is going to reduce the ellipse of the area that you're looking for this illicit activity and down to something reasonable where you can get on a boat and get out there, particularly our African friends in the Gulf of Guinea who don't have a long-range security cutter to do this. They have other assets that, you know, can get them out to sea for a little bit of time and do the job and then get back in. So yeah, I think it's great. Joanne, you're going to say something on that?
Yes, sir. I think, Roger, right, for most cases, there has to be a human being on board. We're talking about, these are inspections when you're outside of the exclusive economic zone of a country. These are high seas boarding and inspection activities that get reported back to a flag state. So it is, boy, it really sounds super law enforcement, but it really, it's an inspection on behalf of the flag state, and so it is far more diplomatic than it is direct law enforcement. But in some cases, simply collecting imagery of a vessel that's engaged in shark finning, as Admiral Vogt mentioned earlier, or taking prohibited species, or fishing in a marine protected area, those things as standalone pieces of evidence, if the quality is good enough to really articulate a person, an activity, a vessel name in a location, they can be helpful. But I'm not sure we've spoken enough about like the will of the international community here. You know, the unregulated component of this problem set is a choice. Yep. We've chosen not to regulate all places in the ocean from the perspective of how much fish you can take, what kind of fish you can take, and what the labor practices are that are required out there. And so I think that's an important part of the discussion. I do think there is absolutely, and in my discussion with Secretary of the Navy just last week, he said a couple things. One, he hates the term counter-IUU fishing. He said, Joanne, you gotta change the name. Nobody knows what we're talking about. But he also really, to the Task Force 59 and the, Unitas experiment down at 4th Fleet, and heck, even organic Coast Guard, we're using remotely piloted and autonomous technologies to really understand the movement of migrants in the maritime domain approaching the Southeast U.S. So I think the future role of this kind of technology and capability is, I wouldn't say limitless, but I don't think we've seen the edge of that capability just yet. And certainly we can speak afterwards. Some of my staff is here to get you looped in with folks doing that work.
Well, and if I can take one quick stab at that, I just want to add that from a lawyer standpoint, one of the things that's interesting about IUU fishing is that if you're doing it right, you actually get money out of the arrests. And so there are incredibly potent stories of countries that have arrested multiple fishing vessels, ended up with millions of dollars, and been able to invest in new technology for themselves. And so one thing to also consider is that we need to be more novel in how we approach the financing of some of these opportunities. And I think there's a lot of scope for that. The other is that prosecution in an actual court is not the only thing that matters. As Armofogo was pointing out, prosecution in the court of public opinion may be even more potent in terms of the marketplace dynamics that actually provide deterrence. And so documenting, providing visibility, providing imagery, it may not be evidence for a court prosecution, but it may be evidence for changing people's minds. And I think that's really important. And the last thing I'd say is just that I think there is a bias that a lot of us have about technology, and there's a classification bias in many cases, where we think that if it isn't available on the high side, it isn't really all that important. This space is almost entirely unclassified. And so it actually is an area where there can be a completely different approach to partnering between technology companies, NGOs, civil society organizations of different sorts, fishing communities, and the navies and coast guards of the world in order to be able to combat it holistically. And I think the more actors we have in solving this problem that affects all of us, the more likely we are to be able to actually do something about it and pop the balloon and not just push the problem in a different direction. So thank you for those questions.
Thank you.
I think, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time together. Oh, I see one more question. I will turn to Gabby for a thumbs up, thumbs down. All right, we got a thumbs up. So please, your question.
All right, I'll try to be quick. Robin Tyner, Navy captain retired, and oceanographer and ship driver background. So currently with Sonalists. And so my question, I was thinking the previous question was going to ask what I was asking, but maybe not quite, because I think a lot of us are very interested in this. I know at my current company, we've got 3 retired Coast Guard captains as well that are among my colleagues. And we've talked about this too, but part of what's not abundantly clear is what are the problems you still need solved and how can we help? And at first I was thinking, oh, maybe it's other capabilities. And then just listening to the answers, I thought maybe is it marketing, is it training? And as an example, in the Arctic, so those of us who worked in the Arctic probably spent a decade trying to figure out how do we make the rest of the world and the rest of the Navy understand this is an important issue. And is the same thing here?
Great question.
I'll add kind of related to that, and this gets into 2015 Global Fishing Watch, and we just heard from Dr. Tony Long was created, and it was an environmental advocacy group, a satellite company, and I can't remember the name, and Google came together, and this organization now is probably the premier provider of awareness of the fish and the fishing fleets around the globe. So in less than 10 years, under the leadership now of Dr. Tony Long, former Brit sailor, and That's a great example and almost exclusively funded by the private sector. Their information, data distribution is free to anyone who wants it. Government agencies use it, the private sector uses it, fishing fleets use it. And an area, and you brought up a point, training, the Coast Guard Shipwriter Program. We regularly work with Pacific Island nations or our partners in Africa, put young Coast Guard officers on board to teach basic training and tactics on literally boarding a ship and safe small boat operations, how to get on board. Some of those skill sets could be taught by the private sector. And so there's kind of two areas there where they're provided resources to fund this immense capability that's creating greater maritime domain awareness. And that is being used with Coast Guard shipwriters, but there's no reason why we couldn't evolve that in the private sector, especially working with some of these smaller island nations to help them develop their capability and capacity. And that could even be in partnership with larger organizations such as the Airbuses of the world.
Does anybody else want to add to that? And I think it's a great question on where are the gaps? What needs to be filled?
I mean, there certainly is a U.S. perspective on where the gaps are, but I think what's more important than that is, what would Palau say their gap is? What would, what would Papua New Guinea say their gap is? What would Senegal say?
I'll ask them next week.
Yeah. Ooh.
I'll be in Papua New
Life
Guinea on
around.
Sunday. I think the one other thing I would just add to that, and this kind of goes to that point, is that this is a space that is changing. Mm-hmm. So the moment you think you've got it solved, I mean, there's a lot of money in this. There's always a risk-reward calculus. If you've changed the risk, people are still going to find another way to try to pursue the reward. And so I think one of the areas that I see as needing to be filled is more rapid identification of changes in behavior and activity. We see this in particular, where there are really good regional approaches. So take the Foreign Fisheries Agency in the Pacific is probably one of the best models of regionalized maritime domain awareness capability for the standpoint of countering IUU fishing. But everybody knows about it. And so the actors that are still looking to take advantage of the massive blue ocean space of the Pacific are going to start with what they know the FFA is looking for and find out what they're not. And so we are always seeing that kind of innovation. And I think more rapid analysis of those changes is absolutely critical to help everyone be able to adapt to a never adapting threat vector.
I love the red cell approach.
Yeah, I'm always the proponent of red teaming. So we need more red teaming. All right. With that, I'll turn to the panel for one final thought in just a few seconds. If you had a magic wand and you could point to one thing that you think that we need to do, what would it be, and who needs to be involved?
As the MSAFE Tri-Chair, I really want to say thank you to Airbus and to CMS for helping elevate the visibility of the issue. And the one thing we don't have is resources. This is a requirement of the NDAA, which is an authorization act, and there was no appropriation that went along with it. So the Coast Guard folks who are in the room are doing this on top of their primary duties, their other duties, and there's very, very little to focus resources directly at this issue. All of you have relationships with members of Congress and with their staffs, and if this is important to you, then it's important to the nation. Certainly it is. Some resources to help identify this as an issue in addition to all of the other things we're doing. That's really what we need. We need continued increases in Coast Guard resources to reflect the actual work that we're doing globally. We're a $14 billion or so Coast Guard. We really need to be a $20 billion Coast Guard.
And with fewer people than the NYPD,
yes.
Doing more with less is not supposed to be your motto. Admiral Vogt.
Yeah, I'll just add, we've touched on it, and I think the private sector has done a wonderful job in engaging on this issue and understanding that it is a global problem, and it's not only sustainability of the resource, but it's sustainability of food sources and ultimately economic security and the other nations that literally live on the ocean. And so just more private sector engagement and understanding the need.
Thank you. Okay.
So I would wish, right? This is a wish, right? For a way to have the consequences of illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing cost more than the benefit of the illegal activity.
I love that. Admiral Fogel?
Yeah, Kim came to our Center for Maritime Strategy, America's Future Fleet Symposium at the end of last year. We always do it after the Reagan Defense Forum because everybody bounces back to Washington and they've got their talking points already. We had National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, Ambassador Robert O'Brien in-house. Very reasonable man, a lawyer. And Kim asked him, so what do you think about illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing? And we were both surprised when he said, act of war. Wow. You know, and there's a guy that's not going away. He's going to be back in future administrations. And if you really believe that, then first of all, you've got to get that out into the public. So public awareness, strategic communication. And, you know, do we want to go to DEFCON 5 over IUUF? No. But what it does is it raises the level of knowledge in the U.S. government and concern. So, you know, I was trying to translate this. Why does he think it's an act of war? Well, if you think about migration on the southern border, why do people want to come up here? Because they can't feed their families. Does this sort of thing exacerbate poverty and the lot that's been given to them? All they want is, you know, a roof over their head, food on the table, you know, education or a job, and a future for their children. And you can't get it when everything gets fished out of your waters off the coast of Peru by the distant water fishing fleet. Mm-hmm. So I think public awareness, and with that awareness comes resources to combat the problem. That's what I'd like to see. And thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all. I hope you will join me in thanking the panel. I think this has been a fantastic discussion.